want to thank for giving just a significant investment of time and energy to make it possible for us to gather this morning. Of course, we want to thank our city and county officials for clearing the roads and making things passable. But within the life of our church, our deacons spent a significant amount of time earlier in the week clearing sidewalks and steps and pathways to get through where the blade pushes the ice and slush to the side and it hardens up to 6 or 8 feet. And they did that so that we could host funeral services here for Bob Griffith midweek. The Hutchins class came in right behind that and even were treating some of the sidewalks outside as the funeral was taking place so that things would not refreeze in the frigid temperatures and make it treacherous outside as we exited after the funeral. And as much as it pains me to say it, the men of Pi Kappa Alpha fraternity, Tom, that's just all I can say. That's the best I can do. The Pikes came out yesterday as part of the Children's Ministry Day, along with several households in the life of the church. And they not only took a shot at clearing off the ice and several inches of snow here, they went out into the community. It didn't occur to me, didn't click, college students do not have snow shovels. I did not have a snow shovel when I was a college student, but I could walk home. So I always had one in reach. But they got over here and we had a list of places we wanted them to go. And they said, I don't have a snow shovel, I'm iced in. So any place that they could reach on foot on that list, they shoveled out and did a lot to get ready for today. And of course, folks like Terry Tackett and Mike Wallace and some of the deacons who are outside right now keeping the facility clear have made it possible for us to be here. And if you're wondering why would we do this on a day when it's still icy, there's a simple reason. This skinny boy over here named Jim. Ain't that your name, boy, Jim? Bob Gregory decided this was the day that he needed to come back to church. And I don't even know what all it took for Bob and Evelyn to get here this morning, in between rounds 2 and 3 of chemotherapy. It's great to see you, and that's why we're here. Yeah. As well as joining in the fellowship with all the saints. So I'm glad we can be together today. It is the first Sunday in the season of Lent. Lent, L-E-N-T, is the season of preparation for Easter, for Resurrection Sunday. It has its roots in the Old Testament. You can find Old Testament passages where folks had the spiritual practice of putting on ashes for a time of reflection or a time of grief. The early church treated the last 6 days and then the last 2 weeks and then the last 6 weeks before Easter as a time of preparation for baptism. One of the practices of the ancient church was that they would prepare candidates for baptism on Easter Sunday, understanding that if you went into the waters of Christian baptism, you were saying to the world, I am ready to join with the suffering of the cross. I'm ready to be next to Christ on the hill called Golgotha. And so it took all that time of preparation to get ready to say that announcement to the world. In about the 4th century, we arrived in the Christian church at something very similar to the structure that we have today, 40 days, not including Sundays, getting ready for Holy Week, getting ready for Easter. And so this year we have a special sermon series during the Sundays of Lent. And the name of the series is Final Instructions. Final Instructions. Jesus' lessons from the upper room, Gethsemane, and the cross. Now, many of you are probably familiar with what we sometimes call the 7 last sayings of Christ. With this sermon series, I want to back up one step before the 7 last sayings of the cross. and look at the final teachings, the final instructions that Jesus was giving to his disciples as he was preparing to leave them, as he was preparing them for what their lives and their ministry would be like after he was handed over, arrested, and hung on the cross. He was trying to prepare them so that the mission of God would continue after his victory over the grave on Resurrection Sunday, when he walked out of an empty tomb. And so today we begin in the upper room, in John chapter 13, as Austin read just a moment ago. And if you'll look with me at the candle that is placed here next to the piano, this is going to be a visual reference for us. It will help us as we move closer and closer to the cross of Christ, closer and closer to the empty tomb. The candle will guide us on our path. We'll move that way over the next several Sundays until Good Friday night, when we find it at the cross itself. This simple, powerful, brief teaching that Jesus offers in John chapter 13. Love one another. Sounds like something we could even just gloss over. Sounds like something we would say is second nature. Of course, Christians want to love one another. And yet Jesus calls that teaching a new commandment. Something new I leave with you, he says. And the reason that Jesus draws attention to this commandment, love one another, and treats it as something special, is because it was shocking. It was shocking then. Even for people who knew the great commandment with roots in the Old Testament. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Something that was borrowed from the Old Testament and brought into the New. It's what Jesus responded to in Luke chapter 10 when he told the story of the Good Samaritan. The person challenged him, but who is my neighbor? Who is this person that I should love? And Jesus gives a radical definition. Someone unlike us. Someone whose faith is similar to ours, but just different enough to drive us bonkers. A Samaritan. That's who you should love. That's who you should understand to be a neighbor. Because even that man who you would consider unrighteous by law lives in righteousness by faith and action. Jesus has already tweaked this teaching once. Back in Matthew chapter 5, at the outset of the Sermon on the Mount, just after the Beatitudes, in Matthew 5, verse 44, Jesus says, you've heard it said, love your neighbors. But I say to you, love not just your neighbors, but your enemies too. Already Jesus has been playing with this idea of the limit or the limitlessness of our love. John chapter 13 is then another application of that same ancient teaching, that tradition. It's as if Jesus is wondering then, what would it say about us as Christians if we were to arrive here on Sunday morning, slush, ice, snow aside, gather in this place and lift our voices in praise, and then immediately divide into factions against one another? That's exactly what happened to John's church. That's exactly what happened to the Johannine community that thought of themselves as Jews who also then wanted to be Jesus followers. And they found themselves kicked out. They found themselves on the wrong side of a divide, the wrong side of a faction where they were kicked out of the synagogue and had to make sense of their faith without their familiar surroundings, without the people who had been their faith community. What would it say about us as Christians if we were the type of people who would shovel out our neighbors, even the complete strangers down the block who look and act differently than us, and yet cannot forgive other Christians? Love one another, Jesus says. not just the Samaritan who you'll probably never see again. Love one another, the people with whom you share Christian community. What would it say about us as Christians if we could engage in ecumenical relationships and interfaith dialogue and have respect for the holy other and never stop slandering other Christians? What would that say about us? The Apostle Paul raised the same concern. In his first letter to the church at Corinth, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, the love chapter, he plays with this same concept, writing these words: "If I speak in the tongue of men and of angels, but do not have love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but don't have love, I'm nothing. If I give away all my possessions, and if I hand over my body so that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." Nothing. This was scandalous for the first century church to think of love in this way. How hard it must have been to love folks, to remain in community with people from all sorts of different backgrounds. People who never would have been connected socially, but because they want to follow Jesus, they find themselves with this expectation to love one another. Oh, this was a shocking teaching then. It's unthinkable today. Nothing could be further from reality today. We live in a world as Christians. We live in churches in the United States that are so heavily influenced by the culture at large. It's difficult to tell the difference. You watch. You've seen it. When Washington squabbles over money, the same language that gets repeated again and again and again on the nightly news shows up in our budget meetings. You know. When they're in session over in Frankfurt and they're squabbling over legislation, in the life of our church, we struggle to make even simple decisions in our business meetings. As a result, church follows culture. And there are fewer and fewer and fewer churches like ours. Nobody really even tries to do church the way we do it anymore. Where all generations are represented in every worship service. Look at the sights and sounds in the room today, even on a snowy morning. We have some teething and we have some on chemo. Ain't that good? All political affiliations, multi-ethnic, multinational, multiple denominational agency affiliations, and yet still large enough to have a robust ministry presence in the community. So few even bother to make the attempt. Here's the bottom line. Christians communicate differently. Or at least we should. Or at least that's the ideal. Or at least that's what Christ and the Apostle Paul are teaching. And I believe we can relearn how to do it. I believe we can relearn how to communicate differently. We talked about it at length in the last deacons meeting, about loving one another in our communication. We laid out a couple of columns. They're actually in the bulletin today. And I hope you'll hang on to that. In fact, you could take probably 10 copies home if you'd like. We will have an 11 o'clock service, so maybe 5 copies. But you could take a couple extra if you'd like. You see that just below the service order in the inside flap in the 9 o'clock service order. That left-hand column is a description of where we are. And when I say we, I mean this culture. I mean Washington, and I mean Frankfurt, and I mean the business world, and I mean when it's news that one news agency reports what another news agency said or thought. Where we are, well, we assume bad and accuse worse and repeat the worst. You see how that progression just keeps adding up, just keeps snowballing? If I start by thinking that someone has un-Christ-like, unhealthy ideals or motivations at heart, if I believe that of someone, whether I consider that person enemy, neighbor, or brother or sister in Christ, it leads to a snowball effect. Assuming bad leads to accusing of worse and repeating worst. But think of where we could be. If we lived out John 13 and Matthew 18 and all of those wonderful passages, 1 Corinthians 13, that teach and reteach us how to communicate in Christ-like ways, how to treat each other like Jesus. We talked about Matthew 25 last week. What if we were to imagine the face of Jesus on Bob or Mason or Ray? What if we were to imagine the face of Jesus on Russ, on Tyler, on Jerry? What if we were to imagine the face of Jesus? Don't you think we'd treat each other in a Christ-like way? So that right-hand column begins to describe what that might look like. What if we were to assume good? We may have misunderstood each other, but I'm going to assume that you meant well. I'm going to assume that you intended to bless. I'm going to assume that behind what you're actually saying is an attempt at something worthwhile. If I operate with that assumption, then what I want to do is understand. I want to ask for clarification. I want to make sure I understand where it is that you're coming from so that we can go where Christ is leading together. And then, I'm very careful then with the discussion that we've shared. I'm very careful then to repeat only with your permission, only with your blessing, what has been shared between us, what has happened between us. Now that we understand one another, I'm going to make sure that I treat that hard-earned understanding with love and care and concern so that we don't get mixed up again. I shared with you last week that today I would have a hope, a goal in mind for each worship service. You can probably already guess that I hope both services will take this to heart. In the 11 o'clock service, I'm going to share with that crowd that I hope they will ask and not disappear. The 11 o'clock service, folks, many of them have been here a year, 3, 5, 7 years. They don't necessarily have a Sunday school class, or if they do, it's only a year or 2 years old. They don't necessarily have a small group relationship. They don't know their neighbors. They just moved in here following work. It's easy for those folks just to disappear. If they don't ask, they can just not show up the next week. That's my goal for them. Ask. Don't just disappear. And this is why it is so important that week after week after week we stress in the life of the church. Here is one and another small group opportunity. A place where you can connect, a place where you can plug in, a place where you can ask and be asked so that you don't have to just disappear. But that's at 11. The goal that I have in the life of the 9 o'clock service is that we would take these columns, the right-hand column specifically, to heart in such a way that we would ask first, asking what it is that we really want to know. What it is that we really want to know. if I can peel back the layer of accusation. And I understand full well that so many times before the question even comes to you, before you even know to ask a question, before you're even aware of the need, it has already been formed and placed to you as an accusation. I understand that. And so I'm asking you to be able to peel back the layer of somebody else's accusation. I understand that. I've been trying to think of some examples. Our community doubled in size when I was in high school and college. It's doubled in size again since I moved away and came back home to be your pastor. A lot of folks are concerned about outreach. A great way to ask that question is, please tell me about outreach at GBC. Or, who do I talk to about outreach at GBC? The left-hand column would ask that question, why doesn't anybody do any outreach at GBC? You hear the difference? You can hear the difference. One other example. You're wondering about a decision or a policy or a procedure or how we do things or why. Question is, please help me understand X. Could you tell me about Y? Who do I talk to about Z? Instead, the left-hand column way of asking that question is, I can't believe person ABC did or didn't do XYZ. You hear the difference? Think of it maybe like doing research. Remember when you were in school and somebody sent you to the library to look something up? Now, you can't go to the card catalog and say, why didn't so-and-so? It doesn't work like that. What do you have to look for in the card catalog? We're going way back here, I know. Subject, an author, or a title. I played with this too on my iPad. You can't go to Siri and get what you want if you ask Siri or ask Google, why is Kentucky basketball awesome? Siri doesn't have an answer to that question. You know what Siri says in response to that question? She gives you a list of Kentucky's roster. I guess that is a pretty good answer to that question. Let me rephrase that. You can't go to Siri and say, why is South Carolina baseball awesome? I don't know the answer to that. I would need to go back and ask Siri, but we'll check it out. You can hear the difference. You get the idea. We can peel away that level of accusation, especially if we imagine going to that card catalog and thinking, now what is the subject? Who is the author? What is the title? What is the information that I really need? Let me strip all that other stuff aside and just ask what I need to know. This is, after all, the season of Lent, the season of soul searching, of stripping away as we walk to the cross of Christ and go through the empty tomb to a life in glory. Many of us are thinking about giving something up or adding something in to our spiritual practices. I'm asking our entire church to make a Lenten observance. I'm asking our entire church to take the next 7 weeks to relearn how to love one another. You can take these copies home. You can write on your mirror, love one another. I know that our deacons are taking this to heart because I hear them reminding themselves and reminding one another, assume good. That's really fun, actually. It's become a great way for the deacons to tease one another, to hold each other accountable. And now, assume good. That's actually pretty fun. And you might enjoy it as well. But as a way of moving into the Lenten season, as a way of moving into these goals, and in particular of moving into this approach, Christians for Generations have done a very special action one day of the year. They've gone back to that Old Testament principle that was brought forward to the New Testament, and they have brought it forward yet again to every current generation, and that is by receiving ashes on the forehead. There's a day set aside for that. It's called Ash Wednesday. It happened this past week, and unfortunately, we were under snow and ice. So most Ash Wednesday services were canceled in our community this last week. As part of our invitation today, we want to offer you those ashes. If you missed out on receiving the sign of the cross in ash on your forehead, if you didn't get to participate in Ash Wednesday, or if as a sign, a symbol of your willingness to share in this church-wide goal, you would like to receive ashes today, we're going to do that during our time of invitation. I'll be standing here to one side to offer ashes. And I would welcome you to come and receive them. Or if there's another decision that's on your heart today, you recognize that as you walked to worship today, maybe you connected with the persecuted church. We woke up today and found snow and ice and had to dig out, and it was a very unusual circumstance. People all over the world today who woke up to persecution or snow or ice or extreme weather of some sort and said, oh, it's a typical Sunday. And they are still walking to worship, or they are still making preparation. And maybe today that means for you there needs to be a time of prayer for the persecuted church, or a time of prayer for those who have been in the cold all week, whether it's because they've been serving the rest of us or because they had no other alternative. Perhaps today, something about coming through the ice and snow or something about this worship service has allowed the Holy Spirit to speak to your heart. And so you know that today is the day for you to give your life to Jesus Christ, to receive Him as your Lord and Savior, to accept what He has done for you through the cross and through the empty tomb, and become a new creation. If you're ready to say yes to Jesus, then Pastor Tim's going to be standing right here, and you can come and share that decision with him. Or maybe you know that when you woke up this morning, you had realized, I can't stay away from worship because those are my sisters and brothers in Christ. And I need to tell them that today by becoming a member of that church. If today you're ready to be a member of Georgetown Baptist Church, we would love to welcome you. We'll probably need to reintroduce you to some folks when we don't have snow on the ground and the rest of the congregation can gather. But if that's your decision today, won't you come and share that with us? Or if today you know that you need to go further in a spiritual discipline, further in your expression of commitment to our God, we're going to stand and sing in hopes that you will do just that. As we sing these stanzas of Just As I Am, would you come, whether to share a decision or to receive the ashes on